Hello everybody. So I have been looking for the ideal makeup release to do a redesign on because as many of you know, I used to do redesigns so much, basically me taking apart new makeup releases, making new mock-ups based on those makeup releases in order to give you guys an alternative version of what I would have liked that new makeup release to be. Huda Beauty came through with the announcement of their 3 mini pastel palettes for spring. Now this just dropped, or this just got announced today. Trend Mood has come through naturally and has provided a very nice picture of the palettes, and they have also provided a brief description. So these are 9 shades with different finishes. Each palette includes buttery mattes, metallic jellies, which is a new formula, and a unique new next generation shimmer swirl formula. They have 3 palettes. They have Rose, Lilac, and Mint, and then they have 3 new brushes that they're going to be releasing as well. With that in mind, I decided to do some redesigning. So this would be the original release. Okay, these are what the palettes are looking like, and then this would be my redesign. So as you can tell, I changed many things. I chose to keep in mind the direction that they're going in with these palettes. I chose to keep the formulas that they had, the finishes that they had. So let's kick things off and start out with the Rose palette. I'll put the original version on this part of the screen and the reinvented one over here. This is my redesign. So right off the bat, you can probably tell that there are many things that I decided to tweak in these palettes. Now, this was one of the palettes that I changed the most. There's really only one color in here that I didn't change whatsoever. Everything else I completely changed. Something that I kept in mind was the theme, which was rose, and the theme was also really pastel shades. So I really wanted to keep that in the palette, and I also didn't want to necessarily limit myself. In some of the other palettes, you might see that I kept things a little bit more monochromatic, but I saw this palette as being a good variety of rose tone shades, as well as some other shades that coincided with this colors. So let's just take this in order and start out with the top left shade. I completely changed this shade. Before it was more of a peachy tone transition color. It was very pastel. What I decided to do is I decided to add more blue and magenta into this shade and thus make it a more pastel, cool toned rose color in fitting with the theme of the palette. Then moving on, I have another shade. Now I believe that this was one of the metallic jelly formulas that they were speaking about when they announced this product, but something that I found that in the original palette was that this doesn't necessarily look like your typical pastel tone color, or at least what I would consider that to be. I saw in my head a rose color that had the exact same finish as the original shade, but had a little bit of a kick to it, was a little bit more just vivid in tone. So I decided to add, again, some more magenta into this shade, and I also increased the vibrancy of it to create a shade that is almost bubblegum pink, but not quite. It still retains that very light, very pastel pink theme without necessarily looking quite boring. But then moving on, you have a very light, very light highlight shade. This is again in that metallic jelly formula, and what I wanted to do is I wanted to take a shade that looked a little bit dull in the pan and liven it up a little bit, because once I changed a whole bunch of the shades in this palette, I did realize quite quickly that this very light champagne sort of sandy color was kind of bringing the palette down, and I wanted to come up with a shade that was a little bit more in keeping with the general theme of the palette and still supporting the palette as well, while still functioning as a good highlight shade. So what I did is I just added a little bit of blue, a little bit of magenta, and I increased the vibrancy on this color a little bit to make it your ideal frosty lilac highlight shade that would pair very well with the pink shades in the palette, but still provide that little bit of variety in the palette as well. Then moving down to the row below that, we have this beautiful matte color, and this color was very plum in tone, okay? However, this is the rose palette, so I wanted to keep in that theme. So I essentially changed, or rather transformed, this color from a plum color into a mid-tone pink. Moving on to the center color, I actually stayed on this color for a little bit because I'll be honest, I don't like seeing like all these like swirly shades in one pan. I, for one, find it quite jarring to see a pan of shadow like that because you generally don't know the exact well, the exact color of that shade, because it's essentially like a juxtaposition of different swirls of color, and you're supposed to mix it to create the color that you want, but it's so difficult to tell exactly what that color would be. So I was kind of like put off by that. I will admit, if you mix those shades together in the original palette, I felt like it would look like a goldier plum shade, which honestly did not fit into what I thought would be this palette, if that makes any sense. So what I did is I just completely reinvented it. I took away those just gold swirly tones, and instead I put in a very frosty looking pink color, and then I also took away those plum tones and I put instead in there a very vivid lilac. So essentially my idea was, if you mix these tones together, the intended effect would be a duochrome lilac and pink shade. So moving on, again, we have another one of those metallic jelly shades. This time this was like a lime green highlight shade. Looking at this palette, these pastels do look quite muted, and I wanted to fix that. So what I did is I just increased the vibrancy of that shade just a little bit. I did nothing else to the shade. I just increased the vibrancy to make it look a little bit more popping. Then moving on to the row below that yellow, I did not do anything to it. I felt like it was fine the way it was. It's kind of like a unique version of a yellow, because usually you see yellows that are a little bit more golden in nature, whereas this yellow is a true lemon pastel yellow, and I really like that, so I just left it the way it was. Moving on though, you have like this weird like looking muted pink lilac color. I wasn't sure what was going on, especially since this is a rose themed palette. So essentially, I upped the saturation of this shade. I made it more magenta, so I added a little bit of magenta, but just enough to make it a mid-tone matte pink shadow. Moving on, you have a shade that used to be a brown. Now, Huda, from what I could tell in her Snapchat stories, she did mention that she wanted these palettes to be wearable. But here's my thing. I'm not interested in getting a 9-pan palette if half of it's supposed to be like wearable shades and then the other half are supposed to be the fun colors. And honestly, I wanted to make this palette a little bit more in keeping with the rose theme, but still add some variation in tone. I could have made this shade into another pink color to keep the rose theme alive, if you will, but what I decided to do instead is I decided to play off of the lime color that's right above it, and I decided to contrast that with a grape color mid-tone purple shade. So the next palette was the Lilac Palette, and honestly, this palette made me a little bit sad. Well, not really, because it's just makeup, it's all fun and games, but this palette made me feel some type of way, because this is a lilac palette, right? So then why are there 1, 2, 3, 4 shadows in here that are very obviously lilac purple colors when this is a 9-pan lilac themed palette? Because everything else, all the other shades in here look like the same old redundant neutral transition colors, and this is a lilac palette. So I was confused. I was very confused because I was like, there's nothing lilac about this palette. So I made a few changes. However, at the same time, I did keep a few shades the same. So the top row is completely unchanged. I did nothing to those shades because I felt like, honestly, there was nothing inherently wrong with those shades in my eyes. I felt like they still provided a good addition to the palette. That top left shade, it could be like a more wearable shade, but it still has enough purpley undertones to it to make it part of the palette. So I had no problems with the top row. I really like that row. That first color in the middle row was a mid-tone peachy jelly metallic color, right? So I'm like, I was confused because this was a lilac palette, okay? So I changed it to an icy, but still quite vivid blue. Now, I know this is lilac, but this blue in my mind had enough of a slightly purple look to it to make it fit into the palette. But see, if you look at the palette as a whole, so many of these colors have like blue undertones to them. So I felt like adding a color that was a little bit more blue into this palette provided that variety, prevented this from being a very boring monochromatic palette, and instead added that punch of diversity to this palette that I think makes it a little bit more exciting. The middle color, oh boy, okay. I changed it clearly because it was a pretty boring color before, in my personal opinion, of course. So I changed it to a very nice slightly darker but still pastel version of a lilac matte shade. You have more of that tie-dye swirly business there as well. And I was kind of like, you know what? These are like swirls comprised of purple and coppery brown. So like, what are you going to create? Like a purpley brown color in a lilac palette? In my personal opinion, I don't really find that exciting. So what I did is I basically changed the swirls to be like lilac and very cool tone bluish lilac. So essentially when you mix these together, in my mind, you get a pretty beautiful duochrome mid-tone lilac shade that has a little bit of a bluish shift to it. Then moving down to the bottom row, this was like a row that I like spent like a little bit of time finessing, because at this point I was really happy with how the top two rows looked, and I was kind of like at odds as to what to add to the bottom row to make it a little bit more cohesive, make it a little bit more of a varied color scheme. So what I started out doing is I completely changed the first row, the first color on the bottom row, and I made it into a very light pastel lilac, when before, I don't know what that color was, but I didn't like it. Then in the middle, you have a bubblegum pink shade. Now, yes, this is a lilac palette, but honestly, in my mind, I think there are only so many different versions of lilac you can do without making the entire palette completely monochromatic, and I think it was clear with all of these palettes in general that Huda Beauty didn't necessarily want to make these palettes monochromatic. It's more that they wanted, in my mind, to create a color scheme inspired by a specific color and to go from there. I like to adhere to a color that a palette is themed with, if that makes any sense. So that's why I have changed so many of these shades to include more lilacs, but I still wanted to add a little bit of variety to prevent this palette from being a little bit too monotone. So I added that pink to add that kick. Then the next color onwards, I actually changed just a little bit because I felt like this plum color, I just didn't feel like it did much to the palette, so I just added in a little bit of magenta into that color. I increased the vibrancy. I just made it more of like a plum purple color with a little bit of a kick. Then I'm about to pull up the last palette, which is the mint palette. Now this is my favorite palette in this entire video. The original palette I'm not a fan of, but the newer version that I redesigned, this is quite possibly one of my favorite redesigns that I've ever done. I changed 6 out of 9 colors, so not a ton, but it still looks like a completely different palette. So first off, you have that first shade in the top row. I felt like there are a few similarities between the shades in this palette, especially with the first shade on the top row and the last shade on the top row. Now this might be just a picture thing, but honestly, in the pan, these two shades look very, very similar, so I decided to fix that immediately by making that first shade more of a mint shade. Now, this is a mint palette, but there's no like cool tone mint pastel color present in this entire palette, so I decided to change that by making the first shade a cool pastel mint palette. Then the middle color on the top row would be your like lime green alternative to whatever was there before, because whatever was there before, it was like this highlight gold greenish color. Not quite sure what that was supposed to be. I wasn't a fan of it, so I decided to change it. I decided to make it more of like a lime green shade because I kind of like the idea of combining like a metallic lime green color in with more of like a mint and teal color scheme. I kind of like that. So the last color in this row was pretty much like a really pretty pastel green color. I decided to keep it the way it was. I like it, you know? And then the middle row, well, the first color in that middle row was, oh my goodness. Now, this shade reminded me of mint chocolate chip ice cream. The trouble is with mint chocolate chip ice cream, though, is that you were combining mint and chocolate. So it looks nice when you look at it in the pan, but how would it translate on the eyes? I wasn't quite sure that I would be happy with that result. So what I did is I basically replaced those two shades that were in there before, and I transformed this entire pan, and I basically put a sage green color and a very vivid, almost evergreen color, and I feel like if you mix these two colors in together, you'd get a beautiful, like almost silvery version of a very metallic mint color. I felt like this would be beautiful, and I really liked it. Then the middle shade, now I wanted to experiment with the idea of like combining different colors in with the mint color scheme, okay? So I decided to, instead of like just going with a champagne taupe version of a highlight shade, I decided to make this like a straight up silver. I feel like it just adds something to that palette. It's a beautiful center shade. It just carries this palette so well, and I really liked it. So I decided to keep that shade, or rather change that shade to be a very, very saturated metallic color. Then that next color over there is pretty much, I decided to change it, and I decided to make this very coppery color into a mint color that would be a metallic, that would be so beautiful, so pigmented, and I really liked it. So moving on to the last row, down there, I changed one color in this row, and that would be that mid-tone brown color. How many times have I said mid-tone brown color in this video? Too many, in my opinion. Too many. So I decided to change this into a grass green. Now, yes, this is a minty palette, but I felt like I wanted to add something there to smoke out a look, okay? And I also wanted to put anything there that was not a brown color, okay? So that's what I did. So I felt like this grass color, a grass tone color, would go brilliantly with any one of these minty, lime green, metallic, silvery shades. I really liked it. And then the other two shades, the last two shades, I kept them the way that they were because I actually rather like them. I have no problems with them, and they looked brilliant with the finished redesign. That's pretty much it for this palette. Those were all the shades that I wanted to change, and yes, this is definitely my favorite redesign of this video, and definitely one of my favorite redesigns that I've ever done. So again, these are the redesigned palettes, and these are the original palettes. Clearly, there's a big difference. Let me know what you think of my redesigns down below. I'm very curious to hear your opinion. Do you have any critiques for me? Do you have any alternative opinions? Let me know in the comments down below, and I'll get back to you. But thank you so much for your time today. I hope you enjoyed the video, and I will see you all next time. Bye, guys.